Hello and welcome back to the syntax lectures. Today, the eighth in the series, we're going to be looking specifically at relative clauses. Now, we mentioned these briefly when we were looking at WH clauses, interrogative clauses that is, and we'll see that actually they have quite a lot in common with each other. First of all, let's start by having a look at what kinds of things are relative clauses. There are three main types of relative clauses. Those are these CPs we see in these sentences. Okay, so that man, who we all know to be a liar, should be quiet. The who we all know to be a liar is a relative clause of one type. Another type can be seen in the second sentence. The candidate who we all prefer should be selected. And the final type, in the third one, whoever I indicate should be arrested. Now these are three different types of relative clause. They have different properties to each other. We call the first one a non-restrictive relative clause, the second one a restrictive relative clause, and the third one a headless relative clause. The distinction between them it ranges from meaning differences and syntactic differences too. For example, between the restrictive and the non-restrictive relative clause, there's a semantic difference to do with what the relative clause actually does to the meaning of the element that it modifies. Relative clauses always modify noun phrases or determiner phrases. And you can see the difference if we compare these first two sentences. So that man, who we all know to be a liar, the who we all know to be a liar there doesn't actually do very much more to identify who we're talking about. That's already given by the phrase that man. The who we all know to be a liar, the relative clause here, just adds extra information about that person we've already identified. Contrast that with the next one, the candidate who we all prefer. Now in this case, the restrictive relative clause does pick out the person that we are referring to there. That is, the person who we're referring to is the candidate who we all prefer, as opposed to another candidate. So what we're actually seeing here is that a restrictive relative clause restricts the reference of the phrase that it's part of, whereas a non-restrictive relative clause just simply adds extra information about that phrase. So they have very different semantic properties. The headless relative is different again because, as you can see, with a headless relative, the reason why it's headless is because, well, there doesn't appear to be any noun phrase or determiner phrase that it's actually modifying. So it appears all by itself, and therefore we can see that, again, it behaves very differently. It's the whole clause, whoever I indicate, that picks out the referent of what that clause is referring to. Another difference we can see between the three of them is in terms of their pronunciation. As you can see in the first case with the non-restrictive relative clause, there's a comma between the noun phrase, the determiner phrase that man, and the relative clause itself, which actually indicates a pause in how you pronounce this. So this is pronounced that man, who we all know to be a liar. So there is this slight pause between the man and the relative clause. Contrast that with the restrictive relative clause, where there's no comma and no pause, the candidate who we all prefer. Okay, so we even pronounce these things differently. Another difference can be seen in terms of what is admissible. This is partly to do with the function of the relative clauses in terms of what they actually do in terms of the meanings that they provide. as we've seen, the non-restrictive relative clause adds extra information, and as such that is perfectly omissible, so you can miss that out without causing any difference really in the meaning of the sentence. So that man should be quiet. Compare that, however, to the restrictive relative clause. Okay, the candidate who we all prefer should be selected versus the candidate should be selected. Clearly, there's a big difference in the meaning here in terms of having left out an important aspect of the referent of the whole determiner phrase there. So again, that shows us that the restrictive relative clause plays a more important semantic role than the non-restrictive relative clause does. Finally, the headless relative, given that that is the whole thing that determines who is being referred to here, clearly that can't be omitted. That would just be like omitting the whole subject of the sentence, and you just get should be arrested there. Finally, and one more difference has to do with what inside the relative clause has to be present. Note, all of them that we're looking at here all begin with a WH phrase. However, it turns out that WH phrase isn't necessary in, well, at least one of these relative clauses. If we omit that WH phrase, note, with the non-restrictive relative clause, we get something that is basically ungrammatical. That man we all know to be a liar should be quiet. Doesn't work. And obviously in the headless relative as well, we get something that is just ungrammatical by leaving out the WH phrase. You can't say, I indicate should be arrested. But compare that to the restrictive relative clause, where missing out the WH phrase still produces a grammatical construction. So we get the candidate we all prefer. So again, then we see that we can miss out the WH phrase in one of these relative clauses, but not in all of them. Also, the other thing that we can do with the restrictive relative clause that we can't do with the other two is introduce it with a complementizer like that. Again, if you do that with the non-restrictive relative clause, we get something that doesn't work given the right pronunciation of this. That is, that man, with a pause, that we all know to be a liar. That just doesn't work. Similarly, you can't do that with a headless relative. That I indicate should be arrested. But it's perfectly okay with a restrictive relative clause. The candidate that we all prefer should be selected. Okay, so the restrictive relative clause can either have a WH phrase at the beginning of it, or it can have a complementizer at the beginning of it, or it can have, well, nothing at the beginning of it, and that's three different possibilities for that restrictive relative clause. The other two, however, always have WH phrases at the beginning of them, and they can't have anything else. So again, there's an internal syntactic difference there between the three types of relative clause. Let's move on now to have a look more at the workings of these clauses, and we'll take them one at a time and have a look at how they are positioned inside the DP and what their internal structure looks like. We'll start with the non-restrictive relative clause. So we see that we've got a relative clause which basically is a modifier of some phrase in the DP. Now the thing is, DPs, typical DPs, are made up of two phrases, one inside the other. We have the full DP, that man, but inside that we also have the noun phrase man. And then the question is, if this is a modifier, and modifiers, as we know, are adjuncts to the phrases that they modify, well, what does the clause modify? What does it adjoin to? There's two options then. Either we could say that the relative clause is adjoined to the whole DP, so in that case it's stuck there at the top of the whole phrase, Or we might say that it's adjoined lower down inside that phrase, adjoined to the noun phrase, and it would have a structure like this. Both of them are going to produce the same word order, that man who we all know. So it's difficult to tell just by looking at it which one of these is correct. However, there are some considerations that lead us to conclude that one of these is the correct version and the other one isn't. For example, if we look at how relative clauses interact with other modifiers, we get a strong indication that the relative clause must be positioned in one particular place. So, for example, take this one, that student with long hair who we all like. Now, the preposition phrase with long hair is a modifier, and we've seen in the past that prepositional phrase modifiers are attached to the noun phrase. They are adjoined to the NP inside the DP, just like adjectival phrase modifiers are, the only difference being adjectival modifiers come in front of the noun phrase while preposition phrases come after the noun phrase. Now, if the relative clause were adjoined at the same position, that is, to the NP, then we would expect that the prepositional phrase modifier and the relative clause modifier would be interchangeable. They'd both be able to appear in any order. However, the facts are that it's not very comfortable at all to put the relative clause in front of the preposition phrase. So we can't really have that student who we all like with long hair. That sounds far more clumsy and not so flowing as the first one, that student with long hair who we all like. That would indicate then that the relative clause is actually adjoined in a different position to the prepositional phrase modifier. Given the prepositional phrase modifier is adjoined to the NP, then we're left with the choice of the relative clause being adjoined to the DP. Okay, so there's one piece of evidence that suggests that the non-restrictive relative clause at least is adjoined high up in the DP. Another observation, which more or less comes to the same conclusion, is the fact that with a non-restrictive relative clause we can have a modified pronoun with it. So we can have he, who we all know. Now, the fact about pronouns is that pronouns are just determiners. There is no noun phrase inside the DP containing a pronoun. And for that reason, then, there's no noun phrase that the relative clause could be adjoined to. And then that leads us once more to the conclusion that the non-restrictive relative clause must be adjoined to the DP, because in this case, that's the only thing there is to be adjoined to. Okay, let's move now on to look at the position of the restrictive relative clause. Once again, we see that they come inside DPs, and therefore we have the same choice. We could claim that they are, like the non-restrictive relative clauses, adjoined high up in the structure and onto the DP, or further down inside the DP, adjoined to the noun phrase. Okay, again, it's hard to see just by looking at it which one of these is correct, so we need to look at some evidence. We can do the same thing as we've just done with the non-restrictive relative clause and look at how these restrictive relative clauses interact with other modifiers of noun phrases, like preposition phrases. This time, however, in contrast to the what we saw with the non-restrictive relative clause, a restrictive relative clause can come in any order with respect to these prepositional phrase modifiers of nouns. Okay, so the man in a hurry that we all admire versus the man that we all admire in a hurry. Both of those sound perfectly okay, and therefore we're led to the conclusion that the relative clause is adjoined to exactly the same place that the preposition phrase is adjoined, and that is the noun phrase. So it seems then that we can conclude here that the restrictive relative clause is actually adjoined to a different position inside the DP to that of the position where the non-restrictive relative clause is. Again, another piece of evidence that corroborates that conclusion comes from the one pronominalization test. Now, if you remember what this shows us, we can see that one is a pronoun that replaces noun phrases. It doesn't replace whole DPs like a pronoun like him or her or it or something like that. One replaces part of the DP, specifically the noun phrase. And if we consider this sentence here, the last book that we read was more entertaining than the first one, we see here that that one is replacing book that we read, i.e. The noun plus the restrictive relative clause. Therefore, we have direct evidence there that the noun phrase, the noun and the relative clause both make up a noun phrase, and therefore, given that the relative clause is a modifier, we know that it must be adjoined to a noun phrase. So again, we see this clause adjoined lower down into the structure. Okay, so that's about the external syntax of these things. That is, the positions inside the DPs that we find them in, and we see there's a difference between the two. What about their internal syntax? That is, how they behave within the clause itself. Well, first let's start with the non-restrictive relative clause. As we've said, these are to some extent simpler because there's only one version of them. All non-restrictive relative clauses have a WH phrase, and the clause itself behaves very similar to the way we've seen interrogative WH clauses working, specifically the ones which are embedded. Because note, they have a WH phrase. Those WH phrases are at the beginning of the clause, presumably, therefore they're going to go into the same position as they do in an interrogative clause, i.e. the specifier of the CP. And furthermore, there is no auxiliary inversion. There is no movement of an auxiliary verb from the inflection to the complementizer position. So we get exactly the same thing in a relative clause, as we see here, as we would in an embedded question, like if we had these clauses as the complement of a verb like to wonder. Okay, so I wonder who everyone likes, I wonder who is very rich, I wonder who you've read about, and I wonder about whom you've read. Note, the fact that you can get these with relative clauses show that exactly the same syntax happens inside the relative clause as does with the WH interrogative clause. You even get pied piping in the both, where you take the whole of the preposition phrase containing the WH phrase, and that can move to the front of the clause. Okay, now, just like we see in an interrogative clause then, that WH element that's sitting at the beginning there is obviously linked to some other position inside the clause, basically some position inside the inflectional phrase. In the first case, what we have there is a verb like is a transitive verb, but we don't see the object, and that's because the object is the who, and the who was moved from object position into the specifier of the CP. In the second case, the who is related to the subject, which is then moved out of the specifier of the IP into the specifier of the CP. Third one, we've got the who in the object position of a preposition phrase, and as we've seen with pied piping, we've got the movement of the whole preposition phrase in the fourth case. So basically what we see then is that the non-restrictive relative clause has a syntax which is identical to that of the interrogative. That is, they involve WH movement. WH movement, but no inversion. So there's nothing ever in the complementizer position, and therefore the structure looks like this. We've got a WH phrase which starts off in some position inside the inflectional phrase. It could be the object, could be the subject, could be the object of a preposition, could even be an adjunct position somewhere inside. But anyway, that WH phrase always moves out of that position into the specifier of the CP, and the complementizer position is left empty. There's not much more to be said about that then, because we've said everything there is to be said about that when looking at interrogative clauses. The only thing to note is, however, that obviously relative clauses aren't interrogative. They don't ask questions. These are declarative clauses which contain a WH phrase which isn't an interrogative phrase. Moving on now to the restrictive relatives, we've already noted that there is a bit of variation with these, more so than with the non-restrictive relative clause, inasmuch as you can start these clauses with a WH phrase, as in the man who I met, or with the complementizer, the man that I met, or with neither, that is, the man I met. These are all called fairly sensible names. We refer to the one that begins with a WH phrase, a WH relative, the one that begins with the complementizer that, a that relative, and the one that doesn't begin with either of those, we call that a zero relative. Now, looking at the WH relative, we see it, like the non-restrictive relative clause, has a WH phrase in it, and moreover that WH phrase is clearly related to some position inside the IP. Here we've got the verb to meet, and meet is a transitive verb which therefore must have an object, and we don't see the object here, and the reason for that is because obviously that is the WH phrase. The WH phrase starts off in the object position and then moves in front of the subject, which again looks to be exactly like any other kind of WH movement, that is, movement into the specifier of the CP in front of the IP. Again, there's no inversion here, so the complementizer position is empty, and we get something which is again exactly like the interrogative and like the non-restrictive relative clause. But clearly we can't apply that analysis straightforwardly to the other kinds of restrictive relatives, the that relative and the zero relative, because, well, they don't appear to have WH phrases in them. However, note, they do have something that the WH phrase WH relative clause also has, and that is a missing element inside the inflection phrase. In this case, it's the object. The man that I met, where is the object there? Because meet is a transitive verb that requires an object. Similarly, the man I met. So both of these phrases seem to lack some element inside the IP in exactly the same way as the WH relatives that we've looked at lack something. Now there, we accounted for the lack of these elements in terms of the movement of the WH phrase. The WH phrase starts off in some position inside the IP, but then moves out of that position, and therefore you don't see it. So how are we to account for the missing object in these cases in the that relative and the zero relative? One idea would be to say, well, the reason why these objects are missing is for exactly the same reason as they're missing with any other relative that we've looked at. That is, that there is a WH phrase which sits in that position and then it isn't pronounced in that position. Okay. Now, in the other cases, we've seen that the reason why the thing isn't pronounced in that position is precisely because it moves out of that position into somewhere else, and therefore it gets pronounced somewhere else. In this case, however, we don't see that. Now, again, another possible analysis to that would be to say, well, no, the WH phrase is there, and furthermore, it moves into the same place where all WH phrases move, i.e. the specifier of the CP. However, what's different about these WH phrases is that they're not pronounced in that position either. and therefore you don't get a pronounced WH element in either its original D structure position, in this case in the object, or in its S structure position at the specifier of the CP. If we think about what this means for those clauses, then we see that the that relative is simply a matter of choice of what gets pronounced in the CP. If we compare the that relative to the WH relative, in the WH relative we see that we get a pronounced WH phrase but an unpronounced complementizer. Whereas with the that relative we get the unpronounced WH phrase and the pronounced complementizer. So it was simply then the only difference between these two types of relative clause is simply what you pronounce inside the CP. Is it the head complementizer or is it its specifier WH phrase? That then leads us to a straightforward analysis of what a zero relative clause is, and that is one where you don't pronounce either the WH phrase or the complementizer. Okay, and given that fairly straightforward analysis, we can see that all of these clauses are pretty much the same as each other. The conclusion we come to then is that actually these relative clauses in terms of their internal structures are very similar to the non-restrictive relative clauses. All of them involve the same process of WH movement. It's just that in these cases, for whatever reason, you can choose not to pronounce the WH phrase. Now then, let's move to the third one and have a look at the structure of the headless relative clause. These are things like this, whoever you meet. Now, these do involve a WH phrase, but note this WH phrase is somewhat different from the others. We've got this extra bit to them, the ever part, and that's something which only this kind of relative clause has. You can't have the man whoever you meet kind of thing with a restrictive relative clause. The ever part is only something that finds itself available in a headless relative. However, just like the other relative clauses, we see we have got a WH phrase of some sort at the beginning of the clause, and furthermore, that WH phrase seems to be related to some position inside the inflectional phrase. In this case, again, it's the object. So meet is a transitive verb. We don't see the object, presumably because the object is the whoever that's moved out of the object position to a position in front of the subject, and again that seems very likely to be exactly the same place where WH phrases in general move to. That is the specifier of the CP. So we've got a movement, a WH movement from some position inside the IP to the specifier of the CP. The complementizer position is empty because again there's no inversion in these kinds of clauses. However, that would suggest that this kind of clause is just a CP. And that is not too disastrous a conclusion, because we find these kinds of clauses in the kinds of places where you can find CPs. So, for example, you can get this headless relative in the object position or the complement position of a verb like to trust. So you should not trust whoever you meet. You can also find them in subject positions, as in whoever you meet is not to be trusted. And these are two positions where you can find clauses. However, it turns out that these kinds of relative clauses have less in common with CPs and more in common with DPs. And to see that, we have to have a look at what the properties that differentiate DPs from CPs are. Well, have a look at this table here. In the first column we've got some facts about DPs, in the second facts about CPs, and in the third column headless relatives. As we've seen, you can get clauses and DPs in subject position. That's one place where both will go. So you can get John is interesting and that John is rich is interesting, where you've got a normal CP beginning with a that in the subject position of this clause. That's fine. And as we've said, that's exactly where you can get a headless relative too. So whoever you meet is interesting. However, one place that you can get a DP that you can't get a clause is in the object position of a preposition phrase. So you can have don't speak about John, but you can't say don't speak about that John is rich. Doesn't work. However, you can get a headless relative in that position. Don't speak about whoever you meet. Okay, and that shows us then that the headless relative has a distribution which is more like a DP than it is like a CP. Another fact about DPs that differentiates them from clauses is that when you coordinate two singular DPs, they add up to make a plural. As you can see in this case in the first column, we would have John is interesting and Mary is interesting, but John and Mary are interesting. The form of the verb there is agreeing with a plural, John and Mary. The same thing doesn't happen with a clause, however. That John is rich and that Mary is poor is interesting. Okay, you don't coordinate the two clauses to make a plural here. You still get the singular agreement on the verb to be here, the form is. However, headless relatives behave in this respect like DPs. Whoever you meet and whoever you don't are significant. Okay, so the two coordinated headless relatives add up to make a plural, which is more like a DP than a CP, therefore. So the picture that we've drawn here of the headless relative as a CP, well, that can't be the entire story, because they are not just CPs. They seem to have more in common with DPs. And that leaves us a question then of how is it that a headless relative seems to behave like a DP rather than a CP? Well, one possibility would be to claim that headless relative clauses are in fact just like any other kind of relative clause. That is, that they are part of DPs. They modify things inside DPs. The only thing is, the thing that differentiates them is that the rest of the DP is just simply not pronounced. That is, the relative clause is adjoined to a noun phrase, and that noun phrase is headed by a noun without a pronunciation. That also comes inside a determiner phrase where the determiner isn't pronounced either. So all you actually see of this whole DP is the relative clause which is adjoined to the NP. Now that would be a possible solution to this problem, because here we see then under these assumptions this kind of relative clause is in fact a DP, not just a CP. It's a CP within a DP. However, it doesn't address one of the central aspects of this kind of clause, and that is this ever part. Why is it that only headless relatives can have this ever along with the WH phrase, and other kinds of relative clauses can't? Well, one way that we could account for that is to make use of this idea here that, well, there seems to be something missing in the DP that isn't pronounced. Maybe what we could claim is, in fact, that this ever is, in fact, a pronounced determiner, that it actually sits into that position there, which therefore means that the WH element inside the relative clause is just a simple WH phrase without the ever there. So it starts off in some position inside the IP. It's going to move, just like every other WH phrase does, into the specifier of the CP. However, because of the special properties of the headless relative, presumably something to do with the fact that the noun phrase itself isn't pronounced, well then what we're allowed to do in this case is move the WH element even further so that the head of this phrase can move and stick itself onto the overt determiner, and you end up with the whoever form. Okay, that would be a movement very similar to the kinds of movements we've seen happening with verbs moving into inflections to join up and form a tensed verb or something like that. Here what we have is a WH phrase attaching itself by head adjunction, presumably, to the head determiner to form this more complicated determiner. Okay, so let's have a quick summary of everything that we've said so far. Relative clauses come in three types. There are non-restrictive relatives, restrictive relatives, and headless relatives. The positions of these differ from one to the other. The non-restrictive relative clauses are joined high up in the DP, joined actually to the whole DP itself, whereas the restrictive relative clause is joined lower down to the noun phrase. Headless relatives, they're like restrictive relatives and are joined to the noun phrase. The only difference there is that the noun phrase that a headless relative is joined to has an unpronounced noun. It has a headless noun phrase, in fact. Finally, all relative clauses that we've looked at here involve WH movement. Every single one of them, even when you don't see a WH phrase in it. They all have, in that case, entirely equivalent internal syntaxes. They differ in terms of their positions, but internally they're identical. They're all WH clauses involving the movement of a WH phrase from somewhere in the IP into the specifier of the CP. That differs from one type of clause to the other, in as much as sometimes you don't have to pronounce the WH phrase, that's in the restrictive relative clause, and in others you can get an extra movement from the WH position in specifier of the CP up to the determiner in the headless relative type. But apart from those small differences, every relative clause is identical in terms of its internal syntax. Okay, that's enough for today, and I will see you all next week. Bye bye then.